Hello YouTube, Dave here again. I am back with another video in the series of just some books in my collection and some of the various interactions or feelings that I have towards them. It started with responding to a viewer question about if there were any books in my collection that I just really had no interest in going back to or ever really picking up or reading through. And so I did that one to start. The second video were books that I picked up that I was excited about, but just haven't had a chance to read them. Like just because things may have been going on in my life at the time that made it difficult to focus on reading and going through the books. So that was sort of the second one, and I was just going to finish it off with the third video, which were books that I constantly found myself going back to and picking up and reading just for enjoyment's sake. And I'm still going to do that. That's going to be the end to this little series, but I was kind of thinking about it, and along these same lines, there are books that I picked up and just found that my expectations were way off the mark, either for the positive or the negative. And I thought it might be interesting to do a video about that as well, where I look at books that I picked up and was either really excited about picking up and just really disappointed in the end with how they turned out, or books that I was kind of ho-hum over or didn't have any real expectations for, and came to really enjoy them and thought that they were really, really well done. Now, this isn't going to be a comprehensive, video in terms of those kinds of reactions for everything that I have in my collection. I decided that I want to keep these to 4 books per topic. Because I find that's what I did with the first video, and it just sort of makes everything have a little bit of cohesion to it. But similar to the books that I've bought and wanted and was really excited about and never got a chance to read, there could always be a part 2 to this video. So for this one, I'm actually going to have both ends of the spectrum in the one video. At first I was going to do it as 2 separate ones, but you know what? I'm just going to have it as just one video because it's sort of the same subject, just different sides of the same coin. So I figure it makes sense to just do it all in one video. And because I want to end on a positive note as much as possible, I will be doing the first 4 books I'm going to look at are ones that I was really excited over, and then when I got them, I ended up just kind of being disappointed with the way that they were. So we're going to start off with the one that I used for the thumbnail, because there's going to be no surprises there, and that was Savage Species for 3rd edition D&D. Now this is a 3.0 book. This is not a 3.5 book, though it was out sort of towards the near the end of 3.5 or 3.0. This was around the time that the 3.5 revision was announced, but it was a few months before it actually came out. So the premise behind this book is it's all about playing monsters as player characters. And I was kind of looking forward to that idea, because some of my favorite memories of 2nd edition AD&D as a player were playing these sort of like monstrous characters. Like we had like Giantkin, Minotaurs. I played a couple of Minotaur characters that I really enjoyed. So there were characters like that I remember from my 2nd edition AD&D days, and I was like, this was the way to sort of recapture that. So I was really excited when it first came out, and that excitement did not last particularly long, unfortunately. I'm not going to go through the entire book, and I could always do a separate review for it, but essentially the big problem with this book is that it just didn't do a very great job of making so I guess to back up a little bit, the way that this book was laid out is your characters, your monsters, were now considered it was a race and your class. So you had to go through the entire class progression of your monstrous race before you could take a single level in something else. And for some of them it wasn't so bad, because if you look at creatures that had a level adjustment of, say, 1, like Drow or something like that, it wasn't that bad. So you'd have, like 2 levels of drow. You'd have like some levels of drow, and then you would be able to take your character class after that. With this one, though, like I said, you were stuck with your race as your class all the way through, and to make matters worse, it doesn't actually have a lot of fully fleshed out or developed races, at least in terms of where you'd sort of expect them in the book. Like with the sample, the Appendix 1 sample monster classes, you do have some, but I really feel like that should have just been the chapter of monster classes, really. And truthfully, the big problem was that just some of these are really, really underwhelming. Let's just have a look here. For example, the Mind Flare. That's the one I kind of want to get to here. Like the Fire Giant. We'll do Fire Giant instead. If you wanted to play a Fire Giant, you are locked into that class until 19th level. So you cannot change anything. Like you can't take a level of fighter. You can't take anything. You can become a level 1 character in the regular character classes for 20th level. And truthfully, I always thought that was kind of pathetic, because really you're not getting a lot. It just doesn't feel like it works the way that they wanted it to. And like this one here, it's the full level 20 progression, but you're a 20th level character with 10 hit dice, a base attack bonus equal to a wizard's. Your saving throws are mediocre, because a 20th level player character would have at least a plus 12 in one of them. So these are kind of crappy all around. So it was just a really lackluster book. And it was one that I've seen other people said they were really excited about as well, and they sort of felt the same level of disappointment. It's just the classes just did not work so well. One of the things that was discussed was the idea of, a better alternative was to simply give them a penalty to their experience. So they could start with, their regular hit dice. You'd have to, the characters would have to be around that level for it to really work. But you just give them sort of a penalty on experience points to make them progress slower than the rest of the party. And I think that would have worked better. So overall, that was just a really, really disappointing book. Next one here, and this, I know I've had some people comment on previous videos that that's some of their favorite books. So I apologize in advance. But this is the Deities and Demigods book for 3rd edition D&D. And it kind of bothers me because I look at a lot of the books on my shelf for the 3rd edition, and when I say 3rd edition I mean 3.0 D&D, and there's a lot of bad ones. I don't know why. I really don't know why. It's just sort of the way that it works out. This one, though, was one that I had high hopes for when I first ordered it, because I had actually picked up the Faiths and Pantheons book from Forgotten Realms first, which actually I believe actually came out after this one. I'm not entirely sure on that. But Faiths and Pantheons was great because it actually gave you a pretty decent amount of information and backstory on a lot of at least the major deities in the Forgotten Realms. So you had, this really great write-up on Bane, and that was the one that I liked the most. But, the major gods sort of all had their large section of information, and it was great. So I sort of had the same expectation. And with this book, I really wanted to get into the background of, deities like Vecna, for example. And it's not, if you were looking for that kind of information, it's just not going to be here in this book. So, for example, we'll go to Vecna, which is on page 94. So here we have Vecna. It gives you basically the same little blurb that you get in the Player's Handbook are very similar to it. You get a little bit of their dogma, you get a little bit of clergy and temples, but none of the background of the actual god itself, which is really disappointing. Then you get their stats. And that's it. I mean, that's it, because then you go to the next deity. So that was really disappointing. And if you watched my Lost Omens Gods and Magic review for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you will know that having the stats for the gods just seems like... this book I think would have been better if it was all about the deities themselves and not just here's their stats so you can fight them like a regular monster. And to me that was the problem with this, is that this book was focused almost exclusively on the stats. It does give you a little bit of information that goes beyond the short paragraph in the Player's Handbook, but not much more. And nothing about the gods themselves so much as, again, like you saw there, the clergy and stuff like that. Now this book was modeled more off of the Deities and Demigods, or Legends and Lore, I think was the retitled version of that from 1st edition AD&D or 2nd edition AD&D, which presented like a smorgasbord of pantheons. So if you were interested in that stuff, this is in here. But again, it's just the stats, and you get a little bit of information like what their domains are and stuff like that. But overall, this was just another book that I was really, really disappointed in, because I just got the better version of this book first, and unfortunately used that to set my expectations. But for those who love this book, I'm not saying it's necessarily bad. It's just not what I was expecting or what I was hoping for, based off of another similar style book from the same era. So that's just sort of where I'm coming from with that. All right, up next we have Complete Scoundrel. So this was another book that I was really looking forward to when it was first announced. The complete series of books for 3.5 were some of my favorite books for that edition. You had the Complete Warrior, Complete Arcane, Complete Divine, Complete Adventurer, Complete Psionic. All 5 of those books were fantastic, and they all had new classes that they added. They were chock full of prestige classes and things along those lines as well. But overall, they were just really, really great books, and I loved them. And I consider those first 5 complete books to be the almost essential pickups for someone who's serious about getting into and playing or running 3.5 D&D. This book, on the other hand, is where the disappointment with this series began. So this has no new classes, like no core classes or anything in there. It does give you some feats. It does give you some prestige classes. Skill tricks might be kind of interesting, but there was nothing, like, as I was flipping through this, I just became more and more, I guess just sort of ambivalent towards it. I just, like, chapter 2 was prestige classes, and chapter 1 was a little bit of information about scoundrels, and it just didn't do it for me. Complete Mage, which is the book that came out after this, is hands down the worst of the whole series. But because I already had this book first, I didn't have those expectations on that one. I do hear that Complete Champion was really good, and I don't have that one because I was just done with the complete series by then, so it's kind of unfortunate. It's one of those books that I would love to be able to pick up at some point to complete that subset, but this is sort of where it started to go downhill, at least for me. Now, if you picked this book up and enjoyed it and used some of the feats or prestige classes or skill tricks or stuff like that from it, then I think that's great. And and I really do. I'm glad that people are able to find enjoyment out of it. But for me, it just did not live up to what I consider to be a complete book when it comes to that series. So unfortunately, this one was just kind of for me. And then finally, when it comes to the books that I had high expectations for and was sorely disappointed, we have Libris Mortis, the Book of Undead. This is, whenever I think of something that I was really excited about and then turned out to be just really horribly disappointing, this is the #1 book that comes to mind. This came out after Draconomicon, and the Draconomicon for 3.5 D&D is one of the best books for 3.5 D&D. The book that came out, so this is sort of like the monster focus series or subset of books for 3.5 D&D. You had Draconomicon, you have this, and then after this book came Lords of Madness. And Lords of Madness was also fantastic. And then after Lords of Madness, you had the Fiendish Codexes, and they were really good. I would argue that Tyrants of the Nine Hells was the superior of those two, but they were both really, really good books. In fact, even Drow of the Underdark was a really good book. It's super hyper-focused on the Drow race, so if you're not into Drow, you're not going to like that book. But for me, like, that whole series was great, except for this. So there was just a lot of expectations that I had. So the Draconomicon went into a lot of details on, like, the ecology of, the dragons, and the Lords of Madness did sort of the same thing. And this does have some okay information in here, but what I was expecting them to focus on was going to be the what I was really looking for were, liches, death knights. I was hoping they'd go into something like a Hucuva, spawn of Caius. Like, there was just all kinds of really interesting things I was hoping that they were going to showcase in here. And then what they have is, like, skeletons and zombies and, like, it just ghosts, and there was a lot of the more powerful undead that they didn't really touch. There is a little bit of information on liches, but they're mostly just sample stat blocks, and it was just, again, really, really disappointing. Like, this was the book, because undead were up there, like, in my top 3 favorite creature types to use. They literally go aberrations, dragons, and undead, and that order can change depending on, what books I've sort of been looking through. So this was something that should have been a, slam dunk. Like I said, Draconomicon was a fantastic book. Lords of Madness was a fantastic book, and this one was just really disappointing. Again, like, skeletons and zombies, like, really, do we really need variants on some of the weakest undead in the game when you could have touched on more important or impressive undead? Like, no Death Knight at all, like, at all in here. Yes, I know it was in the Monster Manual 2, but the Monster Manual 2 was also for 3.0, so it would have been a perfect opportunity for them to have updated it. At least I want to make sure there was no Death Knight, just to make sure that I'm not... Yeah, no, Death Cloak. And a lot of the monsters in here were also really kind of dumb. So, like, Skin Kite, I don't know. It was just a bad book overall. So these were some books that, unfortunately, were ones that I thought were going to be great, and they ended up being just kind of awful, at least based off of what I was expecting or hoping for them to be. Again, it's not saying that if you enjoyed these books, or if they're some of your favorite books, that that I would consider you to be wrong. This is all based off of my personal expectations or personal thoughts or wants from these books, versus what the reality was for me. So it's always going to be different for other people. And again, if Libris Mortis is your favorite book, then again, that's awesome, because I never want to see something that people worked hard on fail, right? I don't, and I hate to say that something is just a bad book or a god-awful book, or, things like that. I really hate to say that. And I'm not saying that Libris Mortis is necessarily awful. It's just not what I was expecting, to such a degree that it just was nothing but disappointment. I guess that's the emotion that I have, the way that I feel about this book. And this came out, what, in like 2004? Let's just have a look here. Yeah, this came out in 2004, so 16 years later, and unfortunately the only emotion that I feel when I look at this book, the spine of this book, on my shelf, is just disappointment. And that's the way that I feel about all 4 of those books there, unfortunately. But again, that's just me, so don't take it as a personal attack. If you really love the books, that's absolutely awesome, and everyone's opinions are always going to be different on these types of matters. So don't take it to heart if some of your favorite stuff was in this section of the video. With that out of the way, though, we are going to look to the happier ending with books that I had really no or low expectations of and found myself to be pleasantly surprised. So we're going to get to that now. All right, so up first in the books that I either had low or no expectations for, that I was pleasantly surprised about, we are going to have a little look here at Champions of Ruin. Like I said, I'm not going to necessarily go through and flip through the book because these are things I can always do separate reviews for, which ideally at some point in the near future I would be able to do that. So Champions of Ruin essentially was part of a two-book series for the Forgotten Realms. You had Champions of Ruin and Champions of Valor. Champions of Ruin was sort of like the Forgotten Realms version of the Book of Wild Darkness, and Champions of Valor was sort of the Forgotten Realms version of the Book of Exalted Deeds. And neither of those two books were overly great, at least for me. Like the Book of Exalted Deeds was just not great in terms of some of the options inside were kind of, I don't think they were play tested very well, and it just wasn't an exciting book for me to read, honestly. And I'm the person who loves the idea that the player characters should be heroes, even though very few people ever seem to want to play a campaign where they are heroes, which is probably a reason why the Book of Exalted Deeds just didn't really go over so well. The Book of Wild Darkness was also kind of it felt like the D&D book that was trying to be, like the dark and edgy one, and it was just kind of okay. They had some weird things in it, like Demogorgon was this like super like rail thin snake like creature. He had like the snake like torso with the tentacles and then hyena heads, even though that's never been the way he was described in D&D before. But anyway, so when this came out, I was like, okay, well, I was collecting Forgotten Realms stuff at the time, so I figured that this was basically just going to be, like I said, that the equivalent of the Book of Wild Darkness for 3.5 or for Forgotten Realms. So I just had no expectations going in, but I honestly found myself to be pleasantly surprised as I was going through it. It was just an enjoyable read. I really enjoyed the work that went into the flavor of presenting options for villainous characters, including some advice or guidelines to have in mind if you want to run campaigns for evil characters. And it was a really solid book. Like I said, I was very surprised by how much I liked reading through it. I never really used any of the stuff in here, and I'm hesitant to run a campaign for people wanting to play villains. It's just not the way that I personally enjoy running D&D. And I tried running a game where the players were all villains, and I kind of felt like I had sort of a good grasp on, what real villains would sort of how they would operate in terms of like I had one DM who was running an evil campaign, but he wrote everything exactly the same way he would write it as if the players were heroes. The first thing we did in that campaign was save a farmer from giant spiders, and then he gave us this letter to deliver and said, well, just don't open it, and we didn't open it. It was just, I don't know, it was kind of surreal because everything in that campaign was done as if not only like it was just presented the exact same way. There was no even twist on it, which is the part that bothered me. And when we tried to do something villainous, the DM fought us on it and pushed back and ultimately didn't let us do anything along those lines. So when I went to run an evil game with the players playing evil characters, they did things that seemed heroic to people who weren't aware of what the motivations were. So one of the first things that they did, because they were new to the Forgotten Realms, they had crossed this dimensional portal. They actually ended up working with the Zentarum, and the Zentarum it was sort of like, I guess it wasn't quite the exact same as how I would write it for heroic characters. But like a standard scenario you might have is caravan guard, where your heroes would guard this wagon, a caravan, and make sure that it gets safely to a town or village with whatever supplies were there. So the Zentarum were actually ambushing these caravans, which had like food supplies or medical supplies for a town that was was suffering from plague that was actually put in place by the Zentarum. And the idea was that they would let this town, they wanted it for, part of their trade organization. So they would basically let it get to the point where they would take help from anybody, sort of thing. And the players, their job was to not guard a caravan, but to ambush one. And ambush it because one of these great champions of the region personally vowed to protect it. And make sure that the supplies got there. So the idea was that the player characters were to ambush this caravan and leave this champion alive. So like they could knock him unconscious, but the idea was to leave him alive so that he would know that he failed, and that the people would know that he failed, and then the Zentarum would come in and say, well, look, we have these supplies, we can guarantee its safe delivery, and that they would be sort of like the ones that are revered, right? So that was kind of, the stuff that I was starting to do. And then the idea was that the characters would also do things to sabotage that hero and the rest of his group, and poison people's opinion against them and stuff like that. But I never quite got that far because one of the players ended up being kind of a dick about it, and just wanted to start openly trying to incur the wrath of the god of murder in the campaign world. So it fell apart, unfortunately, because of the players that I had at the time. But anyway, I guess the thing is that I kind of wish I had this book back then, because it may have helped even more. And this was a really good book. Sorry to get off on a tangent, but this was a really surprisingly good book. So, Champions of Ruin. Up next, we have Races of Everon. So again, sorry for the tangents or the sort of the telling a story to tell a story thing. But this was a book that I bought begrudgingly. I didn't really want to get it because when Everon was first sort of announced and first released, I did not like the way that they were choosing to market it. Wizards of the Coast had pretty bad marketing practices throughout the entirety of 3rd edition's lifespan. They had like the chainmail tabletop skirmish game, miniature skirmish game, and they never pushed it, they never advertised it in things other than the magazines that they already owned, and that people who would be getting them would already be aware of the product line. They never really pushed for it very hard, and ultimately they ended up canceling it around the same time that it won awards for Best Game of the Year. Go figure. So with Everon, I feel like the problem was that they focused too much on what made the setting just drastically different. And it just, I don't know, it felt abrasive, was sort of my take on it. Like they pushed the Warforged front and center. Like the cover of the Everon campaign setting is just this Warforged right on the book. And the Warforged was always kind of described as just this like magical robot that has feelings, and it was not well presented in my opinion, and at least in my area it was kind of difficult for people to get into it because of that stuff. It just felt a little bit too different, and in a way that just felt off-putting, I guess, the only way that I can really put it. But this book came out, Races of Everon, and this is not done in the style of the other Everon books. This is done in the style of the Races of series, which was designed for just the regular, generic 3.5 D&D. And the Races of books were some of my favorites. Races of Stone was probably, in my opinion, the weakest of the 3 that were out at this point, before this one came out. Race of Destiny was really good, and Races of the Wild was awesome, in my opinion. And this book was the same design, cover design, everything. This does not look like an Everon book. So I was like, well, crap. I got talked into buying it because it wasn't it wasn't an Everon book, it was a D&D book that just has Everon in the title, which is really flawed logic if, when I say it out loud and when I think back on it, but you know what? It was enough to convince me at the time. And reading through this, it was unbelievably well done. I couldn't get over how well written the races were. And things like the shifter and the changeling, which to this day I still say that they really should have been named slightly differently so that they don't both sound like the same race. But they were really interesting, they were really well done, and the write-up on the Warforged was actually really compelling. I really got into the idea of the Warforged after reading this book. So this was the book that actually convinced me to go out and get the rest of the Everon product line. And for 3rd edition, at least, or 3.5, I have all of the Everon books, save for the Survival Guide, I think was the name of it, which was just an art book. It didn't have like actual RPG stuff in there. And since I think it was a collection of art from the books, I already had the books, so I just didn't feel the need to get that. But this book was one of those things that completely changed my perception of the setting, which has become one of my favorite campaign settings since its release. So, honestly, this is the very definition of a book that completely exceeded my admittedly low expectations when I picked it up. So, kudos to this one. Alright, so up next we have the 4th edition D&D Player's Handbook. This is a book that I just really had no expectations of. I was one of those people that was adamantly against 4th edition when it was first announced, and I had no interest in actually buying any of the books when they started coming out. I kind of just decided that my collecting days were just long gone. They were over, and I sort of made my peace with that. But I ended up getting this for Christmas one year. It was actually a gift from my mother. And for probably about 6 months or so, I just, put it on the shelf, and I appreciated the idea or the thought behind the gift more than the actual item. So for several months, I never even touched it. I never even opened it, never really looked at it, aside from just flipping through it the day that I opened it. And just one day, I don't know what it was, I just decided that I was going to take this book with me when I went to work, because I was working night shifts for a period. So from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. there's a couple hours of between 3 and 5 in the morning. There's just nothing going on, and all my other regular duties were done. So it was just a matter of trying to fill the time and not go insane. So I took this with me, and I started to really like quite a few things about it. And I started to really get interested in the way that they did certain things, and I came to appreciate the idea behind making the low-level characters survivable and fun, while not. I don't know. I think they did a better job of first-level characters than even 5th edition. To me, 5th edition feels like a step backwards when it comes to how decent first-level characters are to play, but that's a discussion for a whole other video. But this book eventually just changed my mind on the whole edition because I was willing to give it a chance. And, I will say once again, and I hate to have to keep saying this, but I know there are people out there that might be watching this and are not fans of 4th edition. That's fine, but it's time to get over it. I'm just tired of seeing all these comments just flatly slamming 4th edition that I've seen in several other videos that I've done. Now, although I have been seeing a lot more people expressing an interest in going back to this one, which I actually kind of like to see, but this is a book that turned my opinions around and eventually led me to buy the D&D Essentials line, which really opened me up to 4th edition, which I really enjoyed. I actually got a lot of fun out of reading the books, and I liked running the game. I had a lot of fun running that as well. So anyway, so this is one of those books that absolutely, it's sort of the epitome of exceeding my expectations, because at first I didn't have any, but when I, decided to go in with an open mind, I actually was really pleasantly surprised with what I saw here. So this is why this book is on the list of ones that I was immensely pleasantly surprised by. Right, and then the last book that exceeded my expectations would have to be The Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica. This was a book that I was very adamantly against as well. I guess you might be sensing a little bit of a theme with this. But it was just something that I didn't, and to this day I still think that the timing behind it was just bad. This was really the first major campaign setting book that Wizards of the Coast released for 5th edition. Before that, it was the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide. But I don't know if I really count that as a campaign setting. It just feels like a, very much a regional source book. And it detailed the same region that was being detailed in all of the adventures that were being run or written for the game to that point. So for this to have been the first real setting book, and it not be a D&D property, it still doesn't sit well with me. I still think that, if they wanted to release this, fine, but have something to appeal to your existing fan base before you try to go after another market, is just sort of my opinion. And actually, this was another book that I had no intention on getting. But it's kind of funny, and the reason I wanted to talk about the 4th edition Player's Handbook before this one was because I was, after several, weeks or months after I decided that, nope, I wasn't getting that book and I was drawing the line there, I was just scanning my shelf and I saw the 4th edition Player's Handbook there. And it just kickstarted something in my mind, and it just made me think that, I really enjoyed 4th, and I would have if I hadn't have given that book a chance when, I ended up getting it. So I just found myself thinking about the Ravnica setting. It's like, it's out. There's nothing I can do. You can't put the cat back in the bag, sort of thing. So I decided to finally bite the bullet, and I was able to find a copy of it on the chapter's website, and it was, I think, almost half off. It was 40 or 45% off. It was a really good discount. The whole thing came to around $40 rather than the 70 plus it would be if I were to buy it at full retail. So I ended up getting it and reading through it and looking through it, and it's like I really started to like this book more so than I thought I would, which is why it's on this list. The thing that really I got sort of taken by was how easy this would be to sort of reskin and release it as a Planescape setting. Because in the original Planescape, factions were a big part of it. Even after they were disbanded, they were still sort of, a driving force behind some of the narratives. And it just, made me think that, this is a setting that's all about, the Ravnica guilds, but those could easily be converted over to some of the various factions and the way that they interact with each other. There's a lot of great information on how to have just these different organizations interact with each other, like which ones they'd be allies with, which ones they'd be enemies with. And the setting itself, the whole known world, is basically just one giant city. So you shrink it down a little bit, and you have Sigil, and then you have the factions, right, instead of the guilds. So I think that even if you don't want to use this for the actual Ravnica setting, which I will say is pretty decently done in here. In fact, before the Everon book came out, this was going to be the world that I was going to put my next campaign in. Anyway, so I just found myself really, really liking this book, and I would say to others that if you can find it for a decent price, it's worth picking up because there's some cool ideas in here that you can cherry pick or you can reskin to suit the purposes for your game. So that's the one thing that I would sort of advise. And I think that's something that, can really pertain to a lot of role-playing books. Even if you don't use them for their intended purposes, there's plenty that you could do with just some of the ideas that are in there. So I really think that, this one is worth checking out, and I kind of regret the hard stance that I had against it when it was first announced. The timing I still think wasn't great. I still think that they should have done something, a stronger D&D campaign setting first, and then bring this out. But regardless, this was a book that absolutely kind of blew me away with how much better it was than I thought it was going to be. So anyway, that is my list of books that either failed to live up to my expectations or greatly exceeded them. But in either way, these are 8 books, 4 on each side of the spectrum, that didn't meet my expectations for the better or for the worse. So let me know in the comments below what are some books that you picked up that you either were really excited about and ended up being disappointed with once you started reading what was between the covers, or what books did you pick up but really not expect much out of, only to be pleasantly surprised. I'd love to hear from you guys in regards to that in the comments below. So thank you guys very much for watching, hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Take care.